Amen. At the last camp meeting, we discussed feminism. We moved through the three main branches of feminism. And then we moved from that subject of gender into a discussion on Ted Wilson's November sermon. Or was it October? I forget. A discussion of the conference's position on people who are LGBT. So I wanted to give a few thoughts on the last camp meeting. And then we will continue where we left off. In 2018, the message of equality was introduced to this movement. Many people since then have found that idea challenging. Where was the message of equality in 2018? What was discussed in that year was two streams of information. You won't find the subject of feminism or gender equality articulated. What you find is a discussion, a message on two streams of information. Why was two streams of information so opposed? There was a few reasons. It went against what people wanted. It was uncomfortable. It disagreed with their politics. They thought the evidence for it was small. And to justify their rejection of it, they said there's the message, and then there's opinion. Opinions of, I won't say leadership, because I wasn't a leader then, but opinions of European socialists. But why this message made people uncomfortable was if you agreed with two streams, Back then in simple times, you would have to say Republican, Democrat. And in 2018, still fresh from the 2016 election, that is the message of the Battle of Ipsos. And you can call two streams Trump versus Clinton. The minute you do that, there are implications. Implications that start hitting people on the subject of gender. Because everyone knows what happened in 2015. Everyone knows the positions that the Democrat Party takes on gender. And the subject of gender is embedded in two streams of information. But all the other parts people are comfortable with. Except for the part that brings you to the subject of feminism. The problem is it is precisely the part that makes people uncomfortable if I was to be blunt, makes people angry. That brings people to 2019 and the test. The increase of knowledge of the Sunday law. But when did people reject or accept the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law? Here. When it makes uncomfortable. When it disagrees with people's position on their external worldview. When it is thought that there is little evidence. And therefore that they divide between the message they accept and the opinions of some leaders. I'm not saying our understanding of the last camp meeting is all that Panium consists of. But if this was the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law, and this movement had to recognize the existence of feminism, it is not a minor point to understand feminism more clearly today. But I said little at that camp meeting that was new. All that camp meeting was doing was essentially sealing, stamping what had already been taught. For almost 18 months. It arrived in 2020. When we started discussing compromise, what I think can be incorrectly termed just reforms, already discussing liberal versus radical feminism. Understanding radical feminism is not new. No more new than bringing in equality in 2019. The problem was all the people sitting on the fence who thought this was new because they thought they had the option of rejecting it. The same thing happened in 2020 to 2021. What led to the increase of knowledge led to the formalization. But in 2020, we made people uncomfortable, we made people angry. It disagreed with their external worldview. They thought there was little evidence. And instead of being European socialists, because this was not understood or accepted, we were seen as conservative Adventists. I hope you can see now the position we took in 2020 and take now has never been based on conservatism. This is not conservatism. It is combining what God expects of a people who were bought with a price, who are not allowed to live for themselves, and true feminism, true radical feminism, and equality without compromise. The problem is by the time it's spelled out, it's too late. We should all remember the failure this movement made of 2012. Shouldn't say this movement, because Elder Parminder carried that truth all the way through. But the people that thought there was little evidence, by the time we arrive in 2021 and we look back at 2014, shining in all its glory, for too many of the people we love, it's too late. You can't afford to divide the message to what suits and what does not. To continue to wait for more evidence before accepting. We have too many evidences that God makes us choose before He gives that evidence. So the personal is political. It's a movement based on the equality of women worldwide. And it is willing to take apart the structures of society necessary. Recognizing that gender inequality and misogyny is the original sin, the original inequality from which others have learnt and stemmed. I hope as we look back, we can find it encouraging to see the consistent way God has led. I want to make one warning. If you had to be careful with your sources to come to understand feminism, if you're to be careful with your sources to understand feminism, you need to be very careful with your sources to understand radical feminism. Remember, we changed dispensation. It got harder. So at the last camp, we discussed feminism. All these things relate to the time period we are now in. The end of 2021. And one of the most sad events at this point in our reform line is watching Adventism set its course for shipwreck. Ted Wilson, his October sermon. In the midst of all his other points, he makes two. LGBT people are sinful aberrations from the Word of God. I want to give the definition of an aberration. An aberration, for the translators, it's at the top of the document. Aberration, the act of wandering from the right way, deviation from truth, or moral rectitude, deviation from a straight line. I did not know the meaning of the word aberration when I used it, so I thought I should look it up. That's for anyone like me. So they're deviating from the right way. Which Ted Wilson would say is a man and a woman. He also makes another point in that sermon. He says, anyone who says there is no Sunday law, Sabbath, Sunday controversy, is a false prophet. Don't listen to them. So now you have it. Who do you want to believe? Us or the conference? I don't think we've ever so clearly disagreed on the Sunday law. We disagree on what the Sunday law will be about. And we disagree on the position we'll take on that conflict. One benefit of knowing Tamina, there are many, is insight into what Walter Weiss says in German. Some of his latest material being, I think, only in German. I've spoken about Walter Weiss a number of times. But I think what can trip up some people is that Walter Weiss is not the conference. In many ways, the conference doesn't seem to like him. They disagree with him. My argument to that is when you look a little deeper, Walter Weiss just gives voice to the ultimate conclusions. But the point that we pulled from Ted Wilson's sermon was that he didn't just say that these issues of gender are aberrations. He said that they're Babylon. And this is where I believe that you find the conference and Walter Weiss meeting. Where you see Ted Wilson define Babylon in the same way that Walter Veith defines Babylon. So we came from discussing radical feminism, which is timely considering the time we are in now. To recent statements coming from the height of the conference leadership. On all that relates to gender. And it felt fitting in all that context to start asking, what is Babylon? Because that is where we approach gender differently. We disagree with the conference because we define Babylon differently to them. So I had hoped to go into the Amiga history of modern Babylon. We're only going to do the alpha at this camp meeting. So as not to rush. But as you might expect, we want to look at it clearly through inspiration and history. Not through conspiracy theories, not through Protestantism, not through tradition, Adventist traditions that come from Protestantism. Let's look at it as a structure. So first, I want to define the counterfeit. Some of this is a revision of what was done at the Uganda school. I'm going to quote from 2 Red, Redemption. $21.3. And we want to first define the counterfeit. We're going to move through some things that have already been taught really quickly. Men were devoted to glorifying themselves rather than honoring their Creator. Satan found easy access to the hearts of men. He's a diligent student of the Bible and is much better acquainted with the prophecies than many religious teachers. He knows that it is for his interest to keep well informed in the revealed purposes of God, that he may defeat the plans of the infinite. One more quote, 1 NL 50.4. Satan is a diligent Bible student. He knows that his time is short, and he seeks at every point to counterwork the work of the Lord upon this earth. In other passages, she consistently references Satan's work as a counterfeit. A counterfeit counterwork. And Satan is able to do this because he studies prophecy. If you want to counterfeit what God is doing, you can't shallow read. You can't have a feelings-based reading. Satan is doing that. Why Satan is not doing that? Why is Adventism? What Satan is becoming acquainted with is prophecy. In that first quote, it's prophecy. So if he's going to counterfeit, what is he going to counterfeit? Prophecy. Key word. For me, the key word in that sentence, Satan is better acquainted with the prophecies than many religious teachers. What I like is the word many. Satan has been studying for thousands of years. Does that mean he knows more than you? Well, the minute you speak about it, he'll know about it. But she doesn't say that he knows prophecy better than all teachers. And that becomes important when we look at the counterfeit. And how exact it is to the truth. Did Ellen White understand the 5 key waymarks of a reform line? No. There are things we understand today in this dispensation that Ellen White did not have full visibility of. Gender is just one of them. So when she says Satan knows better than many, it's not all. He doesn't know better than Ellen White. He didn't know better than William Miller. But he knows better than many who don't love Bible study and prophecy. Bible study with rules. William Miller's rules. So when we go and look at the alpha history of modern Babylon, beginning in 1899, And this is 16 years before Ellen White passes away. Ellen White is still alive and active. And as Satan works events in Europe, he knows less than Ellen White does. Someone's screen sharing. So we need to keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that point. To counterfeit means to forge, copy, or imitate without authority or right, with a view to deceive or defraud by passing the copy or thing forged for that which is original or genuine. So if Satan wants to counterfeit the seventh-day Sabbath, he's not going to counterfeit by creating some strange ritual disconnected from a day of worship. He just slips it 24 hours later. The counterfeit has to look as close to the original as possible. Because the original has the value. It's going back to what we said at the beginning. If you see feminism that looks as close as possible to true feminism, radical feminism, can you say, well, it's all feminism? Considering equality is the Sunday law. It's close. It's equality. That's like saying Saturday, Sunday. It's just 24 hours. It's just moved a little forward. It's all worship. It's those tiny details that are life and death. So it has to look as close to the original as possible because it needs to bring to itself some of the value of the original. So the appearance has to look as much as to the true so it can steal from the true. It wants to steal value, which is its purpose. What is Satan stealing? He's stealing souls. He creates a counterfeit of the true. He needs to make that as close to the true as possible because it's about people. The people are what gives it value. If he can steal the people, That is what God is treasuring. But they've accepted a counterfeit coin, a counterfeit gold. Used to be a lot of gold mining in Australia. I think many of us know about fool's gold. People think they found this golden nugget. But it's a rock that looks quite closely like gold. And while they thought they had something of value, when they would go to sell it or have it valued, with the disappointing discovery they were holding something virtually worthless. If it looked like a normal rock, no one would be tricked. It has to look like gold. So to quickly review, this is how Satan has always worked. From the beginning of the true plan of redemption, God began with a sacrificial system. So what do you find with Cain? Cain doesn't go and begin some whole new strange type of worship. He takes the true and bends a little piece of it. When we look at ancient Israel, we see that sacrificial system. Ancient Israel, ancient Babylon. These are both church-state unions. If you understand Samuel, Samuel was head of ancient Israel as a state, and also as a religion. The two were combined in their leadership. Gets more complicated in the kings, but that was not God's doing. Still, even under the kings, it's a church-state union. In Daniel 6, Darius makes a decree. Then he wants to go back on his word. And he can't. Why can Darius not say that he'd made a mistake? Because he's Apis bull. A particular counterfeit version of church and state. He's a God king. And a God can't make a mistake. Ancient Israel, ancient Babylon. Both had temples, priesthoods. This was paganism. It's at the cross that we find this transformed. This was the paradigm shift. We'll find another one at the second Advent. But the great change in the history of the world happened at the first Advent. A number of things were changed here. Jesus separated church from state. So, to review, first Advent, this is the radical change. Without me trying to define what that looks like, I've said at the second Advent there'll be another radical change. For the rest of the history of the Great Controversy on earth, God separated church and state. The ideas of a temple and a priesthood ended. The sacrificial system ended. Others were introduced. Baptism, communion. I'm going to put the Sabbath here, though it was before. Because in the process of counterfeiting, Satan gets more precise. Takes him time. I'm not set on a date here. Maybe some are. That's okay. But you could mark 508 or 538. In 508, Clovis was baptized. And the papal church had its first king. Its first state. Church and state were separated. And then what they did was have the church exert pressure on the state. Whereas back here, it's all one person, one entity. One person, one entity. Can we see the church state is different between the true and the counterfeit? God splits them. But with the counterfeit, they are split. And then they work together. So again, the counterfeit is not the same as the true. Exact same. If it was the exact same, it would have to have the same value. If fool's gold was the exact same as real gold, it would just have the value of gold. The lack of value is because of that tiny difference. We see that combination of church and state for the 1290 years after 508. Leading up to 1798. The same time, the counterfeit has a deadly wound. The true starts to rise again. But papalism is just a counterfeit of the early church. The way paganism was a counterfeit of the sacrificial system God introduced. So what we want to spend time on is modern Israel and modern Babylon. We can learn a lot through understanding the counterfeit in the ancient world. Paganism or papalism. But we need to understand how the counterfeit manifests today. So we all know by now the structures of modern Israel. Millerite history, 1888, 144,000. And what I want to spend the rest of this camp meeting on is looking at the counterfeit of Millerite history. That if that's the true, somewhere over here, Millerite history will begin to be counterfeited. And I've marked that as beginning in 1899. So, Satan studies prophecy. He knows better than most. He didn't know better than Ellen White, except that he read everything she wrote. He couldn't get inside her mind. So he knew well. Modern Israel rises up in 1798. We can go back now with our understanding of reform lines and we can start laying over our structure. The group's called Increase of Knowledge Formalization Test. But how does Ellen White view Millerite history? What does she have to say about it? I have to make some room. I want to suggest she sees it in the following way. What Ellen White discusses is times of scattering and times of gathering. So she would say that God's people were scattered during the 1260. And in 1798, they begin to be gathered. So pre-1798 scattered, and they're gathered from 1798 to 1844. So this is a gathering time. She then says from 1844 to 1850, they are again scattered. But beginning in 1850 to 1863, there is a gathering, but it's limited because of the Laodicean condition. In 1863, we recognise they're again scattered. So we could then go to 1888, and then we would go to 1989. But this is the alpha history. 1888's coming in another attempt, but this is the alpha. So when Satan is going to counterfeit in 1899, through the history of 2 world wars, it's not going to be based on a reform line as we only understood in 2019. It's going to be based on what Ellen White understood and wrote about 150 years earlier. And it's this template of scatterings and gatherings we find in modern Babylon. So we should expect when we look at the counterfeit, it's not going to be exact. It's going to be full of mistakes. So the true is scattered over the 1260 years. It's 101 years between 1798 and 1899. And what the papacy suffered in that time period over a century, it wasn't all done in 1798. Right through the 1860s, quoting, they had 15,000 square miles of what was central Italy with thousands of subjects. They levied taxes and paid for this lavish lifestyle with 700 servants and a big and growing bureaucracy around them. Then in 1870, Italy's nationalists have a revolution. They throw the Pope out, they get rid of the Papal States. The Vatican goes from being an empire, an earthly empire, to a little postage stamp size of property called Vatican City. I only included that quote because I wanted us to see it wasn't all done in 1798. They might argue that 1870 was worse for the papacy than 1798. It's 101 years of crushing disaster. We all know that 30 years after 1899, papacy is on the rise. We know of the Lateran Treaty. But the Lateran Treaty didn't have it happen in a vacuum. The Lateran Treaty is one part of a bigger gathering. And it's that larger story we want to see. To understand why, after 101 years of crushing, suddenly the papacy is having success after success working with fascism. That larger story of their rise that we're going to discuss tomorrow. So to review, we disagree with two men who symbolize spectrum of Adventism. Of Adventist leadership. Ted Wilson and Walter Wyeth. What we disagree with is how they define what Babylon is. In 2021. So we are going to look at modern Babylon. And if we want to define Babylon correctly today, we should understand them from when they rose up. So we know precisely where we disagree with Adventism. And in that context is a warning that where we choose to divide the message into what suits and what does not, how much of that is an acceptance of a counterfeit? Because the value difference between a true and a counterfeit is in the fine detail. And when we let go of the fine detail, that's called a compromise. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for how you have led your people all the way from Eden. Thank you that we can meet together. As we still gather in the upper room, I pray that you will unite us. As Tamina taught, not on feeling. May we be united on truth, bound together with a love for souls, a desire to save others, the sacrificial love, that you demonstrated on earth, that we might be fishers of people. Beginning with a good example. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.